Okay, we've made it to our CPR settings panel, which is the fourth panel on the wizard. And sometimes, depending on the speed of the read, you may skip right to this and skip right past 3D settings and data import if you don't have anything to import. So this is a very important panel that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the reading and usefulness of the X-ray. And CPR stands for Curved Planar Reconstruction, which is essentially saying we're going to make a curved volume of this 3D image and we're going to reconstruct it. So we're going to make ourselves a pano. So colloquially known as like the pano curve, for instance. Okay. So when we first enter our CPR settings in Acteon software, it's going to ask what pano region we're working on, the mandible or the maxilla. What's nice about this is both jaws have different shapes. So they should have their own CPR style of curve. So for this patient, since we're going to be working on the mandible for our number 19 implant, that's the one we'll focus on. But first, I'm going to show you how I would draw the maxilla and give you some hints, tips, and tricks for the best way to do it. So we're going to select maxilla. And here we have two of the X-ray 3D rendering kind of 3D settings here, and that's going to help us to align. So in this phase, we can also correct some minor patient positioning errors. So let's say the patient's chin was just a tad too far up or down, or maybe the patient was tilted a little bit to the right or to the left. And this is one of those screens where we can kind of correct some of those mistakes. So in this example, the patient is maybe tilted just a little bit up. We can see their occlusal plane has a little bit of a tilt to it. So first things I'm going to do is just click, and that will move my planar line up. And so now we're in the maxilla. And if the patient were tilted left to right, I can drag this line to be even with the occlusal plane or the patient's true horizontal Frankfurt plane, right? On this one, since we're looking at the AP tilt, I can tilt this back and see that I'm trying to make this line close to the occlusal plane, okay? So when I do maxillary curves, generally I'll go to about the height of the apices of the roots, like you see here, because that's where I want my main focal trowel to be focusing. That's where I'm going to find most of my pathology and my sinus anatomy and whatnot. Okay, so when I draw my maxillary curve, personal preference, I like to draw it at the apices of the root in the maxilla, and I tilt it so that it's even with the occlusal plane. Quite simple to do now. We're going to do one click for each nodule we want to make, and we're just going to kind of work our way through the root apices here. We'll start behind one tuberosity and work our way to behind the other. So the maxilla looks a little bit more like a horseshoe, and this is the curve reconstruction that we're going to get on this patient. Now, we'd already seen on the initial read with this patient that mucositis in the patient's sinuses, which we can still see here, right? A little bit of swelling or some mucus in the sinus. And at this point, if we want to read something a little bit more pano-esque, we can change the thickness here to 10 millimeters. Okay, we can even change it to 20. And what that's doing, as you see here in the axial slice, that dotted white line, that is now our focal trowel that it is reconstructing for us, rather than just a single 0.2 millimeter slice. We also have the option that we mentioned earlier but didn't use for the different views. Some people prefer the RACEM view. I like the MIP, or the maximum intensity projection. That gives you something that looks a lot more kind of friendly and compatible to those of us who've been reading panoramics for some time. Now, if you want to see the full pano, maybe to screenshot or to print, we can, now that we have our ideal focal trowel drawn, we can now drag that yellow back to the midline, or I'm sorry, to the occlusal plane. And so we can see a little bit of both jaws. Now, we want to see more than that, right? We can go over here and choose this increase panoramic region button, and it's going to vertically increase both up and down kind of the full view of what we're looking at. So we can kind of click that until we can see everything. All right, so, but notice this is focusing mostly on the maxillary arch because that's the focal trowel we drew it for. Okay, so we see a much cleaner view of the maxilla, and we're losing a little bit of the data on the mandible. Okay, so if we're happy with that and we're working on the maxilla, we can move forward with our next step. But what we're going to do is now do the mandible. So if at some point we're planning the maxilla and the mandible in one case, you're going to want to come back to CPR settings and reset the curve. So I'm going to hit reset, and I'm going to change this to mandible. And I'm also going to change my image back here to MPR and 0.2. And with the same occlusal plane, so I haven't changed the tilt at all, I'm going to go usually about mid-root in the mandible. The teeth tend to be more straight up and down. We don't need to do as much of a flare at the apex. And now we're going to do right through the body of the mandible with our points. And we get a better view of the mandible itself. And there's two schools of thought here. At this point, if you prefer, you can take the time to move the nodules and maybe even add some more nodules by clicking on the line. And we can map that IA canal. And we can make sure we get that nice and clear. Right? So here we've got a nice clear IA canal. And some people prefer to do all of this in the pano curve. So we'll do it on that one side so you can see the difference in the next panel. But if we want to make a changing view for the MIP, to give you a better view for our pano, once again, now we're focused on the mandible instead. So generally, I'm going to keep it in this until I have the nerve drawn, and then I will change it to a 10 millimeter thickness or a MIP for navigation purposes. But notice the shape of the curve is different in the mandible and maxilla. Also, as we move forward through the teeth setup and implant planning phases, we're going to have an odontogram in the top left that shows us all the different teeth. So for instance, we're adding implants. It's only going to show us one arch. So if you're only seeing the teeth up there that are, say, from 1 to 16 and you're trying to work on the mandible, you need to go back to CPR settings and make sure you've toggled on the mandible here. That's going to dictate and determine what teeth it's allowing you to place implants, teeth, and so on for. Okay, so our next step is going to be the nerve mapping and the nerve drawing, and I'll showcase why doing the nerve mapping kind of in this screen versus not, the two different differences in that. So let's go to the nerve drawing panel now.